The Inflation of Enlightenment. A video about the Inflation of Enlightenment, the Hawkins Scale, calibration, and the book 1000 by Ramaji and Ananda Devi. Hello, this is Chris speaking, Shores Infinity, with a video one of you has asked for. Could I review the book 1000 by Ramaji and Ananda Devi? I can. I bought the book for this purpose. I read it and I was shocked. It has shocked me to the very core. I didn't have very high hopes for it, but the book is much worse than I thought. And it has even called for me into question if there's any point in putting out any information about what enlightenment is. The probability that this gets misunderstood and misconstrued and co-opted by the ego is so very high. If you don't know what enlightenment is, then your ego cannot pretend to be there already. If all kinds of people, like I, for example, try to describe what enlightenment is and what it isn't, then it's so easy for the ego to say, now I know what it is, and I'm already there. That is the first thing the ego wants to do. So, if you do calibrations, for example, according to David Hawkins, the less ego is there, the better. The higher you up on the scale yourself, the better. And beyond 700, there will be almost no ego. Under 700, there will be still some ego. And this will definitely try to capture the idea and use it for its own purposes. Also, if you calibrate, you shouldn't suffer from psychosis or personality disorders. And at least 10% of the population nowadays is suffering from one or several personality disorders. And narcissism is one of the most common. So what does a narcissist do if he or she discovers the calibration method in the Hawkins Scale? Of course, he or she will think, wow, finally a way to measure consciousness objectively and prove that I am the best, that I am on top. If the Hawkins Scale goes up to 1000, then I must be at 1000, of course. Who else? And if there's a way to measure consciousness by calibration, then I am, of course, very capable to do this. This is very dangerous. So this kind of project can easily slide down into some kind of spiritual ego masturbation. The problem now, and one problem that we have nowadays, is that most people cannot recognize narcissists, although they're out there everywhere. For example, politicians. Many people think politicians are normal people who somehow worked or bootlegged their way up. No, most top-level politicians are seriously disturbed narcissists who manipulated and bullied their way up to the top. That's why it also doesn't matter much if you vote for this party or another. Both parties are chock full of narcissists and psychopaths. What shouldn't happen is that one of these narcissists writes a book about spirituality. Take Sam Vaknin, for example. Sam Vaknin is a high-level narcissist who writes books and has a video channel about narcissism. That still works because he's talking about his own illness from his own experience. It's not a theory of narcissism. He talks from his own experience, and almost everything he says about narcissism is correct, and he has completely revolutionized the mainstream view of narcissism. That's still okay. But if that kind of narcissist lays his or her hands on calibration and the Hawkins Scale, something completely else comes to light. Namely, only his or her own narcissism reflected in this method. There is no objective method to measure anything. Everything is subjective. If enlightenment, if the path of enlightenment is teaching us anything, is that there is no objectivity. Everything is subjective. Everything is subjective. There is no objective method to measure anything. Not the Hawkins scale, not another scale, nothing. These are all models. Spiral dynamics, finders locations, Hawkins scale, they're all models, and the map is never the territory. If you confuse the map with the territory, you're lost. Very, very, very lost. In all of Hawkins's books, at the end, there's a little addendum where it explains what you need to calibrate properly, exactly, and what are the pitfalls. Obviously, these two persons have not understood this or read this little addendum, because the calibrations in here, there are 800 pages. This is a really thick book. 800 pages of absolutely absurd calibration results. Now and then there's a correct one in there, which is what baffles me even more. Every 10th person or so that is being calibrated is calibrated more or less correctly. But all of the rules and laws of calibrations are basically broken in here. And that's why there are so absurd results. For example, there are more than 100 people quoted in here that are supposed to be at Hawkins Scale 1000, which is the highest, according to Hawkins, that human beings are capable of reaching. This is complete nonsense. More than 100. And who also? It's like children playing a dice game or some game of imagination and having a list, and then, this guy could have, let's say this one has 700, this one 1000, the other one 555. It's very funny, this exact, it's very difficult to pinpoint the tenths, like 510, 520 and so on, but to calibrate someone at 678 or something is ludicrous. Because also when people change their consciousness, they're not always at the same consciousness through the whole life. What time of their life was calibrated here? And then there are some bizarro calibrations like Aleister Crowley, 659.8 or something, which is rounded up 666, the number of the beast. Ooh. It's painful to read this book. There's also, as far as I can see, there's almost no mention here of David Hawkins. So this is David Hawkins' method, supposed to be developed a bit further by Ramaji and Ananda Devi. But there's no mention, almost no mention of David Hawkins, except in the calibration, as one of many calibrations. So he's mentioned, but it's not saying, okay, I got this method from David Hawkins and now I developed it a bit further. If you don't know about David Hawkins, you think, that they invented the method. Which they didn't. So by now I can understand why the widow of David Hawkins is so protective of this method, because oddballs like these two will invariably pervert this method and create this inflation, which they did. They calibrated almost everyone in here a few hundred above the actual calibration. Several hundreds too high. And on the other hand, it's also probably a fault of the widow of David Hawkins, because she's too protective that people don't dare to mention that they got it from, or that it's further development of the Hawkins scale, because then they might get sued by her. So it's actually better not to mention that for some weird reason. So there's no good solution. But still I understand her better now, because this is exactly probably what David Hawkins and she were afraid of would happen someday, and it has happened. The copyright is 2014 and 2019 by Ramaji, printed in San Diego, California. 1000 The Levels of Consciousness and a Map of Stages of Awakening for Spiritual Seekers and Teachers. What often happens is that spiritual seekers and teachers get stuck in turquoise Spiral Dynamics, 500 Hawkins scale, and location 3 on the Finder scale. And that's where they stay, and they think they have reached the top. They haven't. But if someone who is at 500, location 3 turquoise, and has a personality disorder like narcissism, gets into contact with this method, this is exactly the outcome that is very predictable. Almost all the calibrations are too high, except when they are way too low. Some of them are way too low. It's very apparent that this is thought up. This is not calibrated. These two persons cannot calibrate. Now and then there is a hit in there somewhere, also in the descriptions of the levels. Yeah, why not? Because it's already written in David Hawkins' books. So if you take something from David Hawkins' books and put it in here, then of course it's correct. Although even David Hawkins has made some mistakes while he was developing this method. It's natural. If you're a pioneer, you will make some mistakes, and hopefully others come later and iron out these mistakes and fine-tune it. But this is the opposite of fine-tuning. There's some really weird calibrations in here, like for example, Margaret Thatcher, above 300. That's totally ridiculous. Most people are between 200 and 210. If you're below 200, this is already a big problem. Even 180 or 190 is a huge problem. These are very unstable, dangerous personalities often. So already 10 or 20 makes a big difference. To put a power monger like Margaret Thatcher at above 300, how can this happen? It's not possible to explain. The only explanation is that the person who calibrated this has no idea. Of course, to put people like Buddha and Zoroaster and Jesus at 1000 is easy. Anyone can guess that. You don't need to calibrate. Charles Manson, the psychopathic serial killer, well, he didn't kill anyone himself, but he made other people kill. The infamous cult leader, he puts him at 653. That's non-duality, like Eckhart Tolle. And he puts Charles Manson at the same point on the Hawkins scale as Eckhart Tolle, who is being calibrated at 674, which is about right. That's correct. In the late 600s. That's where Eckhart Tolle most of the time is. So I could go on and on pulling out examples where this book is very, very much besides the mark. But this is not the point. The point here is the inflation of consciousness. First, the misuse of a method by crazy people who have not yet left their ego and have not yet solved their psychological problems and their inner traumas. And secondly, if you just put everyone at 700, 800, 900,000, then this can only be called an inflation of enlightenment. It's very rare. Enlightenment is very rare. And it's okay like that, because it's also not that great. It's not rapture. It's not angels singing. You can see the truth, or more of the truth, but that's about it. I've never met anyone who said, "Whoa, who was really there, was or is really there. Wow, it's so great. It's wonderful." It's not. It's neither wonderful nor not wonderful. It's very neutral. So these people who always brag about how great enlightenment is, yeah, they're not there. They're usually in the 500s on some religious tangent. And that is also why they want to teach it. They want to teach it because they think it's great, and why not make a few bucks on the side? Why not? Indeed, why not? If you really teach what you're talking about, and if you can deliver, but it's not teachable. Enlightenment is not teachable. It's fate. It's fate and grace if you get there or not. And it's not very desirable either. But what often happens in spiral dynamics green, yellow and turquoise is a vast overestimation of what enlightenment is and where you yourself are on this or that scale of consciousness. And the ego always wants to be at a higher scale, always wants to know best. It's not about knowing. It's not about knowing. It's not about thinking. It's not about who's further or better or more advanced or higher up, more enlightened and stuff. That's not what it is about. That's so very clearly an ego point of view, a first tier point of view. Who is higher up the scale? That's children's play. That's not what it is about. So I'm very much doubting what I'm doing on this channel, if I'm just making the problem bigger, the big confusion that there is on the spiritual marketplace. At some point I thought I would bring some clarity into it, because so much out there is just plain wrong. To put out a little bit of a different perspective. But this is mostly misunderstood, judging from the emails I get and the comments under the videos and so on and so on. Many of these questions, or even forms of advice, come from a very deep place of egoism and misunderstanding of the whole thing. I cannot for the life of me understand how you can make a dick measuring contest out of the spiritual path. But obviously a lot of people can, because that's all they do, so they do the same with spirituality. That is why UG and Jed call it the spiritual marketplace. It's the ultimate sleeping pill. You think you're doing something spiritual, but actually you're continuing with your egoic dick measuring. Who has the biggest dick? Who has the biggest car? Who is the most advanced? It's always the same and has nothing to do with spirituality. Same as this book, it has nothing to do with spirituality. It's an atomic bomb of egotism. I'm sorry to say. It's great that someone attempted to write a book like this. I'm really grateful to the person who suggested a book review about this. I'm also very grateful to Ramaji and Ananda Devi to try to write a book like this. It's a great endeavor. Only in this case, I must say it failed. Unfortunately. I really would have liked to be surprised. I didn't have very high hopes for it. But I would have liked to be surprised and find a great book, or find a book with a few mistakes. But the whole book is a big mistake with a few things that are correct sprinkled in there. It's really shocking. It is shocking me to my very core, and I really doubt going on myself with putting out information, because it's obviously can only be misunderstood by most listeners. It's not my objective to make the spiritual marketplace bigger, to give narcissists more ideas how they can inflate their ego and inflate the idea of what is enlightenment. Instead, you could ask yourself the question, why am I seeking enlightenment? That is a much better question than what is enlightenment. Why am I seeking it? I don't know what it is. I just know it from hearsay, and I don't know if that's true, but I'm seeking it anyway. Why is that? Why do you want to be enlightened? That is the important question here, nothing else. Not where other people are on the scale, but where you are and why you are there, and why you want to move on the scale, if there is one. And please remember, the map is not the territory. Theory is not practice. Those are just models. Everything is subjective. There is no objective method of anything. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for liking, subscribing, and joining me on Patreon. And thank you very much, especially to all those who have already joined me on Patreon. Thank you.